Hello, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick. Today with me, as always, is Evan. Good day, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, so let's talk as we continue our ramp up here to our look at the story of Adam and Eve. I'm running out of good ways to refer to this story because today we're going to take aim at the characterization of it as the fall of man. I also take some aim. We'll do that coming up soon here at the idea of calling it the story of Adam and Eve. At which point I've run out of things to call the story. Genesis 2 and 3.
You call it the third story of the Bible. Is that what we're going? Or
Yeah. Well, second, I guess,
Bible?
but second and third combined almost. But
Yeah.
yeah. So we'll just look at the fall of man for today. Colloquially, that is often one of the titles you'll see referred to this story. You might even see the heading in the Bible, the fall of man.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth noting that's not something that's in the original text. That is something we have added to it.
Written with headings?
No, it wasn't.
or verse numbers. I thought they had a heading font in ancient Hebrew. Yeah. They had limited space on stone tablets or on papyrus, but they still managed to put headings
to add headings.
To say we're gonna
increase the size
on that. Yeah, we're gonna increase that size by
Yep. Nope, no headings, no verses, no chapter numbers, none of that stuff. However, that is what a lot of people think of this story. I would like to challenge whether that is the right way to conceive of this story as sort of the fall of man. And three of the interpretive, we talked about needing to make interpretive choices. This story forces you to make those interpretive choices. Three of ours, I think, directly influence this idea, right? The first being that, as we have said, we're going to look at this story from the perspective that the historicity of it is irrelevant, right? So we're not looking at it from a perspective of saying, well, this absolutely does not record the events of a moment in time. But we're also not going to look at it from a perspective of saying this is absolutely the recording of events from a moment in time, right? We're going to treat it as irrelevant. If you're treating it as irrelevant, it is only in light of looking at it historically that it becomes this fall of man, this moment in time where man moves from one state, this unfallen state, to this fallen state. The second interpretive choice that is involved in this is seeing it as a tale of universal sin, not necessarily original in this chronological sense. Obviously, if you're looking at it as describing original sin, it must therefore be the first and be chronological, and again describe the sort of movement of man from this one state to this other state, and that being a falling state. And then the third addresses actually that idea of sort of like the fall of it specifically is we talked in some of our very first episode about seeing in the Bible a story of maturation of humanity, of moving from this humanity moving from sort of a more infantile state to a much more mature state, and that being sort of a progression we see in the Bible. And we've highlighted a couple things that indicate that, and we will highlight several more as we go on, especially when we get into things like the story of Noah. There's a few moments in there. So the fall, all right, so the idea of seeing this story as the fall of man, when that is not a phrase that is used anywhere in the Bible, it's not. It suggests that what is described here is in a way avoidable. It's something that could have not happened, right? Man could have not fallen. And that is, I think, honestly, a stretch, based on what we see here. And I think we have several things to indicate actually the opposite, that this was in fact something that was unavoidable. So one of the things that this story establishes is that man is not God, right? That is very clear. Image of God, but not God. Now, man also, we see, is given free will, right? We're not, a computer program set to run, right? We have this element of free will. So given that only God is capable of making perfect sinless decisions in all contexts, it seems therefore then inevitable that the less than perfect man, given the combination of free will, those two things combined, can only mean that man will end up choosing sin at some point. Right? If we have man who's not perfect, yet given the ability to make choices and given the ability to make the right choice and the wrong choice, if you would have to be perfect to only ever choose the correct choice. So eventually we're going to make the wrong choice.
Why do you say that man isn't capable of perfection?
Well, because only God, definitionally, only God would be capable of making the correct choice in all contexts, in all circumstances, in all situations.
That's a part of your definition of God?
Yes, that is what it would be to be God. God is the only sinless, blameless being. He's the only one capable of being sinless and blameless.
I feel like you're running into the doctrine of original sin again.
No, we're not, and we'll show why we pull out from that in a minute. But yes, it does seem like you're getting there. Yes.
Because you're arguing for an inevitability to Adam's choice again.
I'm arguing for inevitability to all humans' choices in that.
That's okay. That's very close to the doctrine of original sin.
I think, well, again, I think the only element of original sin that is highly important is the universality which it implies. And so this...
Yeah, but the universality, I think, is observational. I don't think that's the case. Okay.
I think actually that is the point of what Genesis 2 and 3 here is trying to teach us. I think that's the lesson that is being taught here, is the inevitability of sin for humans. Okay. And we'll get into more detail as we get into Genesis 1, but to give an overview of why I say that, look at the elements of the story, right? The elements of the story are not you have the plethora of ways to sin available to you that we now have, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, no, you have one thing. You have one thing. There's only one thing you have to avoid. There's only one sin you could possibly commit. Even if there's only that one sin that you have to avoid committing, you end up committing that sin.
Yeah, with no compelling reason.
Right.
Aside from
because, well, we'll find out. It's not because of no compelling reason. It's because of innately who you are.
Well, that's conjecture beyond it. I mean,
no, we'll get into why that is. It's in the story, but yeah.
That's an interpretive choice.
Well, again, Genesis is a story that forces you to make choices, so you do make an interpretive choice, obviously.
Correct. But the statement I made before was an observation of the story. Yours is an interpretive choice. An observation of the story is there is no compelling reason that was presented to them.
Well, no, I mean, some would argue that the serpent is presenting a compelling reason. And what I am arguing is that...
Who argues that was a compelling reason? It's infantile.
No, I don't disagree that it is. It is certainly infantile.
So that's the point. It's not a compelling reason.
No, but the
it's
point is,
look, you're gonna reap all these benefits if you do this. It was
what we see though is the woman in the story.
Given,
the woman in the story makes it compelling though to her, and that I think is the key. That is where I say,
if you define compelling based on the action, then certainly. But if you define compelling based on whether it seems like a good reason or not, and it stands up to like a cost benefit analysis, that's no, sure, different than compelling.
But no, I think compelling is inherently, like, compelling is not like some objective thing out in reality. It is all it's all determined by us whether something is compelling or not. Whether something is compelling or not is a product of our own internal assessment of something.
Okay. We'll say then the argument was one that would have worked on an infant and probably not many older.
That is, if we choose to read it at face value, that is absolutely the way that looks. Yes. Yeah. Yes, is it looks like an argument that is only persuasive to an infant. However, I think the what is demonstrated there though is inherently the nature of the woman in this story, and we're going to get to exactly what I think she represents next episode. The inherent impulse of the woman in that story was to translate that into something beyond what the serpent said, into something compelling for her. And I think that's actually part of the point, is when presented with very poor arguments, we have this ability to persuade ourselves to see something as compelling that we probably shouldn't. So that's what I mean when I say it is inherently a part of us to do that. It is inherently something that we do.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it's yes, the outside reason may not look compelling to us, but we create a compelling case ourselves.
I don't see that. Again, I see this as observational. I don't see it as eliminating the possibility of humanity making the right choice.
I don't see, but that is what then now, because that is the part of it that is, you could say, is observational, that is describing the universality, comes to the point at the end, right? When we see exclusion from the Garden of Eden for the entire race of humanity, that is symbolically telling us, all of you are like this. That's why none of you are in Eden. All of you are like this. Mm-hmm. All of you do this thing. Mm-hmm. That is a symbolic representation of the universality of it for humanity. Mm-hmm. It's just in a story. And again, we're choosing to take it not one way or the other in terms of historically. In terms of a story, you could represent that best. You could represent all of humanity not having access to something most easily by just representing it through the two progenitors of all of humanity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that is where the universality of it is presented at the end. Mm-hmm. But what I want to get specifically to, though, is why I don't call it the fall per se. And that I think is important. Because what I presented above doesn't necessarily prevent us from classifying this as the fall, right? It's just that naming of it leads to the perception that there was something avoidable, right? That calling it the fall implies that this was avoidable, which again, the term the fall, it's not in the text. It's not in there anywhere. Nowhere does anyone else call it the fall of man. Right. Mm-hmm. So at best, theoretically, we could say it was avoidable. But practically speaking, we see that as impossible. And again, I would argue that the story itself, by kicking humanity out of the garden, is saying to us, no, this is universal, right? This is inevitable, but it's universal, right? Not one of you could not do this kind of thing, right? And so I think seeing the story as calling it the fall, right? The reason we built in that term and we built up a bunch of ideas around it is a result of seeing the story necessarily as historical and describing a moment in time when sin first occurred, right? Because it gives us this reason to look at this as a moment where we transitioned from this pure Edenistic state away from it. Mm-hmm. Now, that perception, I'm going to argue that it's not only not necessary, but it also seems odd in light of Genesis 1. But let me first point out a couple of other things that within this story suggest that that's a very strange interpretive choice, right? One of the main ones being actually the pairing of the man and woman. You have a lot of people will argue, and I think it's reasonable that you have sort of the establishment of marriage here between man and woman, right? That is why the man will cleave onto the woman, leave his family and cleave onto the woman. That is described in there. That becomes weird when we think of the idea of revelation and sort of a perfected, glorified life as it was meant to be, right? And we often see that described as like a return to Eden, but that doesn't really make sense, because Jesus says that, no, in the kingdom of God, none of you will be married. Mm-hmm. Yet in Eden, we see marriage. So that already implies some sort of, it's not exactly the kingdom of God, right? Eden is not the final state that humanity is meant to be in. Mm-hmm. The kingdom of God is the final state that humanity is destined for, is meant to be in. Eden, we already see, is not that. Mm-hmm. The presence of the serpents also would seem to indicate, well, this is not the kingdom of God. In Revelation, we get the idea that the serpent is defeated, right? And that signifies the sort of the fulfillment of the kingdom of God. So when we look at Eden and we see it as this state that could have gone forever, I think we see in the story right there elements that are, no, of course it could not have gone forever, because we now know that was never meant to be the final destination for humanity. The final destination is the kingdom of God. So looking at it as the fall doesn't quite make sense, because a fall implies, well, you were meant to stay up there. But I think it's pretty clear from some of these story elements, no, that wasn't meant to be the status quo, the eternal, the thing that remains. That's not what we're seeing represented in this story. And again, if we look at Genesis 1, 2, where we see the idea of bringing order to a chaotic world and that process needing to continue forward, right? That's what is presented, that God brings order and then puts the image of man to take over from there and continue this ordering process, right? We don't see that there is a fully ordered world at the end of Genesis 1. It doesn't say that. Mm-hmm. We see God take a break from the ordering process, but we don't see, God doesn't say now things are perfect, right? He says they're very good. He doesn't say they're completed, doesn't say they're finished. We see that he is pausing from this process. He is, for the time being, setting aside his, direct involvement in that and bringing about the ordering process. So then to consider Eden as this place where, well, it was done, right? The perfect order was there. That doesn't quite make sense either, right? And then humanity was supposed to stay there. And again, another element that I think argues against that is the idea that this is a garden. This is not the whole world. This is a garden. This is a small bit. Thus, going back to Genesis 1, the implication there being that, well, that order needed to extend out from there across the whole world, right? Mm-hmm. So there is an eventuality that Eve and Adam leave the garden, right? Now, one could argue, well, this didn't have to be the way that they could have left it, right? They could have left it without having sinned, without having done this, and then gone out into the world. Okay, fair enough. But it also is not clear that this wasn't always the way they were going to leave the garden. This isn't the way that they were always meant to leave the garden. It might have been baked in there from the start that this is the way they were going to leave the garden. And that is where I look a little bit at the idea of the maturation. And I see a little bit of that idea that maybe this was about them maturing to the point where, they could leave the garden. So again, go ahead.
I don't take exception with the term fall, though. I get what you're saying, but I think you're contending with an interpretive structure that can coincide with the term fall. But I don't see, if you look at it from the maturation perspective, it's like if a kid is growing up, there is a time when they're young and innocent, and then there's a time when they and they tend to be rebellious from a young age. But there is a very more distinctive rebellious stages that they go through, and so it's not to say that the infantile stage is the ideal destination, of course, but it certainly feels like, probably, I don't know for the kid, but certainly for the parent, as a setback of like,
no,
this is.
So you're going where I was going next. And actually I'm going to tell you, it's actually the exact opposite of what you're saying. Because
then why do parents get into so many arguments with their kids when they turn 16 and start to drive?
Well, hold on. I will get to that. I will get to that right now. So let me, because I think you're on the right, direction here with things, that the maturation thing is the thing to look at, right? Any parent recognizes, though, that there is a moment where your child makes a choice to do something you've told them not to do, right? And in fact, it's more funnily, but with both of my kids, that they literally watch you while they do it, which is very interesting, right? They've been told no, they know not to do that thing, and they will listen early on, right? And then they will reach a point where they think, I could still do that. You will tell them no, and they will watch you as they proceed to grab something they weren't supposed to, or do whatever it is they were told not to do, right? Now, we're looking at just a moment there. You're looking at the whole, like a trend, right? And a trend of, not listening and wrongful behavior, that is troubling, right? However, if my kid never did something that was in opposition to my instruction, given the reality of who humans are, right, and that we aren't perfect, I would be concerned. I would be concerned that there was something wrong with them. If they never went against my instruction, I would think that there's some developmental issues, actually. I would be concerned that they aren't able to think and process things and make choices for themselves, right? Are they diminished in some way because of that, right? So there is, and what this tells us, by the way, is there's something significant about choosing to do what's right versus just simply following orders like a robot, right? So whereas you're talking about parents having disagreements, yeah, you're going to have disagreements and that kind of stuff, because the goal is you would like your kids to choose to make the right choice. But if you got the sense that your kid was never choosing to make the right choice, they just did it always, how are we to know they're not the robot, right? In that case, and they just do whatever, we as an adult have programmed them to do. It's about choosing to make the right choice. That is what is significant. And here's how it's significant in this story. To be righteous is to choose to do right. To be righteous is not to be a robot and be programmed to do right, right? To be righteous is not to do just what your instinct inherently tells you to do. This is why we wouldn't describe an ant as righteous. I don't know any point in the Bible where any creature other than a human is described as righteous, because humans to the best of our knowledge, seem to be the only creatures with this capacity to sort of choose right and wrong, to choose the righteousness. And the first time you make that choice is a significant moment of maturation. But as a parent looking at a kid, I actually don't know that they're making the choice to do the right thing until they first choose to do the wrong thing.
I don't think I'm talking. I'm not I wouldn't disagree with you on any of that. That's fair enough.
Well, but now the term the fall, though, right? Because that's what you're talking about.
Which is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the consequences. And that's why I referenced later ages rather than earlier ages, because this is something that's irritating enough to be kicked out of the house. This is something that is disagreement so abrasive as to say you are being kicked out of the place that you grew up in and the sanctuary that a parent provides, which I think is a good description of what a parent is doing, is providing
what is a parent for that time. No, right. But when a parent kicks the kid out, what are they doing? They're saying to the kid, hey, if you think you can handle the responsibility to make these choices, go out in the world and see if you can.
Not saying
so when Adam and Eve are
I'm not saying
it's
a bad thing from God's perspective. We're looking at this from God's perspective. I'm saying for the kid, that's terrible. That's a fall.
No,
you were in a state of you're telling what
we
you're telling me.
We chose to move out eventually, right? We didn't choose to live at home forever.
You're telling me 20 years from then it's not a problem, or even once they've started to get it on their feet. The immediate consequence of you were in a state of you were in a fantastic place where all your needs were taken care of, and now you're having to scrounge around to figure out how to make things work, and you're having ramen every night, and it's a luxury if there's an egg on top of it. Like, that's the difference. And my argument is, look, yeah, that's a fall. That's from somebody's perspective would say, yeah, that's a fall.
That's a fall if you are Adam or Eve. Okay, fine. If you want to say that, I get that. But from the perspective of humanity,
here's why I like it, because I like not reading it. I like reading it non-historically. I like reading it more allegorically, which means this is the fall of man. That
phrase is never used.
That
phrase is never used.
In the Bible, fall of man. Yeah, agree. Right. I'm not arguing with you with that. Okay. I'm saying why I don't mind the word. Is saying that this is what you are destined for. You are going to experience this in your life, where you are going to exit some sort of state of goodness, and you are going to be struggling with the earth to bring out some sort of food. You are going to go through that. So that's why I like calling it the fall of man in a general term. I get what you're taking exception to. That's why I said I think it's an interpretive structure that you have a problem with.
Well, no, because here's why.
And the fall of man falls into that interpretive structure pretty nicely.
No, the issue is this. The issue is that the fall of man implies, right? And I understand what you're saying, right? And from what you're saying, I don't disagree that the term may be an accurate one. The problem is the fall of man implies this unavoidability, right? The fact that this wasn't inevitable. Whereas I might argue that no, what we're seeing there is God kicking them out of the garden, saying, yes, now you're going to struggle, right, against the earth, and that's going to be part of it. But by doing this, I guess you now have the knowledge of good and evil, and you're now ready to go out in the world and put that to use then. Right?
Your contention, though, was that their sin was inevitable.
Yes.
So you said
it's a marker.
Fall of man is that it's inevitable.
It's a marker of maturation. Because as a parent, right, once I see my kid,
I'm not disagreeing. I think we're disagreeing on whether you can call that marker the fall of man.
Yeah,
whether you can even refer to that as a fall. It's like, well, yeah. It's when you're going forward, you fall. When you first learn to walk, you fall. Like,
yeah, but you now know, we know you know how to walk when you don't fall.
Okay.
And so that's what I'm suggesting, that this is more a story of saying, okay, I guess you know how to walk, right? And I mean, a loving parent doesn't boot their kid out of the house if they don't have some faith that they're not going to get killed, in the process of being out there. So they clearly see that they have some level of capacity. It may be earlier than you had planned to, right? But you're clearly looking at them saying, well, you have some level of capacity, and you seem to be saying you have more than I think you have. So, okay, go prove it.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying it's not being read from God's perspective. I'm reading it from humanity's perspective. And I like that reading from humanity's perspective, because it's like, yeah, you're gonna fall.
I think if we're looking at that from humanity's perspective, again, it seems to me that the fall implies that we can return to that place, or that we could have not left that place. Whereas to me, it's more about, you were sent out from this place maybe earlier than was planned, but you were always going there.
Yeah, I'm referencing what it feels like. You're going from the larger. I'm referencing that when you are walking out of a place of artificial.
Yeah. I'm not saying you're incorrect.
Artificial grace.
Yeah.
And then you are forced into the difficulty that is the world. It's like, that's the point that feels like, yeah, that was a fall. And what did I do to end up here?
No, you are correct to interpret it that way. I am saying that I think our decision to call it that has led to the negative interpretations that I am suggesting. So I am saying that what was that?
Which is fair enough.
Yeah,
that's why I think it's an interpretive issue. And
right, it's not that
like that because of it, but
yeah, it's not that the word is necessarily an inaccurate word. It's to me, I'm hesitant to use it because it feels like a incomplete summation of the story, right? Because you are correct, it captures this particular feeling. But to me, that particular feeling is not the summation of the story. It's an element of the story. So if I call the story The Fall of Man, I've now made it. This is the story of that feeling, right? And that to me feels like this is not the main thing you're supposed to be taking away from this story. That's an element of what you're supposed to take away from this story.
Well, it's used in the terms of like the fall from someone's good graces.
Right.
The same way that we would use that. You're in the good graces of the king, and then you fall out of his graces.
Exactly. And that goes to my point, right? Because that then presumes that you could have always remained in the king's good graces. And my argument is,
it just describes reality.
No, you were never going to remain in Eden. No, I'm saying what people imply. If you say, well, he's fallen from the king's good graces, that leads me to say, oh, well, then what did he do to fall from the king's good graces? Because if he hadn't done that thing, he could have remained there forever, right? And I'm suggesting that if we look at the elements of Eden that we then later see taken away in the kingdom of God, right there, the fact that those things change should signal to us that we were never meant to remain in Eden. If the kingdom of God does not include marriage, but Eden does, then we must not have been meant to remain in Eden. So we may have fallen from the king's good graces, but we were always going to leave those good graces eventually.
Yeah, I don't think that's worth getting rid of that, because I don't think that that's a very clear direct correlation there. I get the argument. It's better to argue and just say, look, we were never meant to be in Eden to begin with. Arguing that we have to rename the fall of man because of that, it's like, well, maybe the guy wasn't supposed to be in the king's good graces. Like that's
but we were clearly meant to be in Eden for a period of.
And maybe he was meant to be in the king's good graces for a period. It's I don't know. That is. that feels like a stretch to say that we have to get that the fall of man is the reason why we have this interpretive structure.
But you admit that you're only calling it that title, you're only content with that because it describes one element of the story. And my argument is,
I think you describe it one element too.
You don't, right? I haven't given a name to the story. I'm not describing. That's my point. Is I don't think this is a good name. I don't know yet what the right name is to call this story. I just know that one focuses on one element of it, and thus disproportionately presents that as the moral of the story, the takeaway of the story, those kind of things. I think we have overemphasized that particular feeling you're talking about, and we thus have created this guilt, I think it's tied into the idea of original sin. This like, hey, we screwed the pooch, right? We could have stayed in Eden. If only they hadn't done that, we could have remained in Eden forever, right? And because they did that, we're out of Eden. And man, that sucks. And it's like, no, you're always going to go out of Eden. Eden's not the kingdom of heaven. Now, how you went out might have been different. Sure, that's fair. You may well have left Eden differently.
Yeah, but I almost even like that better, because it's like you are inevitably going to fall out of grace. Like that's if you're talking about the king's good graces, it's like when things are going perfect in your infantile stage of artificial protection, you're gonna fall out of that. That's not going to last,
Yeah, and I would even say if you wanted to call it the fall of men, that might even work better. The fall of man, I think, does sort of imply this one historical moment, and all of humanity had this. If you said the fall of men, and this is universally what we all do, that I think would make even more sense. But the fall of man, I think, is specifically a phrase born out of the doctrine of original sin, and the idea that it was this one moment in time that all of humanity was negatively affected by, whereas, as you and I have suggested a little bit, no, this is something we all do. And so if it was the fall of men, that would even make sense, or the fall of humans, right? Or how humans fall, right? Something, I think there's many different ways you could go that would still capture that idea. To me, the specific, the fall of man. And again, I still think, what was that?
Reigning men. I mean, that's what it is.
There you go. Yeah, sure. But I still think fall once again emphasizes the falling out of good graces. And even that, I think, does not capture the thing that I think is important, which is the inevitability of leaving Eden. Whether by this or by some other means, man was eventually meant to go out of Eden. I mean, you could call it the disgraceful exit from Eden. If you wanted to call it that, maybe you capture both things, right? It is that. It's leaving Eden in disgrace, right? Disgraceful. I mean,
discharge. If nothing, it's catchy. I think that's what
dishonorable discharge. That's what we'll call it, right? The dishonorable discharge from Eden.
I think we need to tell people to email us with their best
names. Yeah, best terms, something.
Yeah, whatever they can come up with.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. Shoot us that email at unschooledtheology@ protonmail.com and let us know. I think if you followed us to this point, sort of get the point of the contention that we're making, right? That I think that the fall overemphasizes a particular perspective, but Evan, I think rightly, doesn't want to lose that perspective in terms of how we title and name this story. Give us what you think is the correct way then to title this story. If you think something might work better, let us know. And we'll be back a couple more preview episodes, and then we'll dive into the Garden of Eden. So until then, we'll see you.